The first thing Duke Adrian Ashford heard when he returned from the brink of death was not a prayer. Not a sob, nor the voice of a loyal heir pleading for him to live. It was his nephew whispering to the doctor, "If he dies before dawn, Ashford becomes mine." The words came to Adrian through darkness so dense it felt almost tangible. He could not open his eyes. He could not turn his head. He could not command his own hand to move beneath the heavy blankets drawn up to his chest. Fever burned through him like a second blood, pulsing behind his eyes, along his throat, beneath his ribs. Until he could no longer tell where his body ended and the fire began. Somewhere nearby, rain beat against the windows of Ashford Manor. And the wind pressed low against the glass like a living thing trying to get in. The room smelled of damp wool, bitter medicine, dying candles, and the faint metallic sharpness of fear. Yet he could hear. That was the horror. He could hear the servants crying in the corridor, certain their master would not survive the night. He could hear the old clock in the corner marking each quarter hour with the cruelty of something that did not care whether a man lived or died. He could hear Dr. Harlan Reed breathing too quickly near the foot of the bed. And closest of all, he could hear Lord Julian Ashford, the young man he had raised almost as a son, speaking in a voice so soft and calm that Adrian might have mistaken it for grief if the words had not been so. "Do not waste another dose," Julian said. "The fever has done most of the work. Let it finish." Dr. Reed's voice trembled. "My lord, he may still recover. The medicine from London could lower the fever if given. And if he recovers, he will ask why his illness worsened after every treatment you administered." Silence followed. Adrian tried to move. Every instinct in him surged against the prison of his own flesh. He had commanded estates, silenced parliament men, broken creditors, dismissed liars with one cold look across a table. But now he lay trapped in his own body while the heir to Ashford stood beside his bed and discussed his death as though settling an account. Julian sighed almost impatiently. "You owe too much money to discover a conscience tonight, doctor. By morning, the household will mourn a tragic fever. By next week, the solicitors will confirm what everyone already knows. I am the nearest male heir. Ashford will pass to me. He is still breathing. For now." The bedchamber door opened. Footsteps entered, lighter than Julian's, faster than the doctor's, carrying none of the hesitation of people waiting for death to make decisions for them. A basin was set down. Porcelain touched wood. Water stirred. Then a woman's voice spoke from near the bed. "Why is the last dose still untouched?" Julian's tone changed at once. "Miss Bennet, I thought Mrs. Wren had sent you to rest." "I do not rest while a patient's fever rises." There was no fear in her voice. Adrian knew that voice, though only barely. Clara Bennet, the village nurse, daughter of the late Thomas Bennet. A physician who had treated poor tenants without charge and offended wealthy patients by telling them the truth too plainly. Clara had been brought to Ashford Manor 2 days earlier when Adrian's fever worsened and the nearest reputable London nurse refused to travel through stormy roads. Adrian had seen her only once before the illness took him fully. She had stood at the side of his room in a plain dark dress, her brown hair pinned severely. Her hands reddened from cold, and her eyes steady enough to make him aware that she did not admire titles merely because they stood higher than she did. At the time, he had scarcely noticed her. Now her voice was the first sound in the room that did not feel like a threat. Dr. Reed cleared his throat. "His Grace is beyond the benefit of aggressive dosing. Too much medicine could weaken him further." Clara moved closer. Adrian felt the air shift as she leaned over him. Cool fingers touched his wrist, searching for his pulse. He wanted to seize her hand, to force his body to obey, to tell her what Julian had said. Nothing answered him. His hand lay still beneath the sheet. "His pulse is weak," Clara said, "but not failing. His skin is burning. His breathing is shallow because the fever has been allowed to climb. He needs cooling, clean linen, and the London medicine now." Julian gave a soft laugh. "You speak boldly for someone called here because no one else was available, and you speak calmly for a man standing beside a dying." The room felt constricted. Even through the fever, Adrian sensed Julian's silence. Clara had struck too close to something true. When Julian replied, grief returned to his voice like a cloak draped over a knife. "I loved my uncle long before you arrived with your village remedies and your father's old superstitions. My father kept more men alive with those remedies than most gentlemen keep promises." "Careful, Miss Bennet." "No, my lord, His Grace requires careful hands. Not careful words." Adrian would have smiled if his face were his own. Julian turned away sharply. "Doctor, remove her." "No," Clara said. The single word was quiet, but it did not waver. "I was hired to nurse the Duke," she continued. "Until Mrs. Wren or His Grace himself dismisses me, I will do exactly that." His Grace himself. The words pierced Adrian like pain. If only he could. If only he could open his eyes and dismiss everyone in the room except the woman now. Wringing cold cloths into a basin. Beside him, Julian stepped closer to her. "If he dies under your care, Miss Bennet, the responsibility will not fall on those who knew him for years. It will fall on the poor nurse who insisted she knew better than a trained physician." A lesser woman might have recoiled. Clara did not. "Then I had better keep him alive." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Julian exhaled softly, as if amused by a child, though Adrian heard the anger beneath it. "Very well. Watch him then. But remember your place. This house has buried people far more important than you." "And yet tonight," Clara replied, "it seems to need me." The door closed after Julian and Dr. Reed left, but Adrian did not relax. Fear had grown too large inside him to leave with them. Julian wanted him dead, Reed had been bought or threatened into helping. The household believed the fever was natural. And Adrian, Duke of Ashford, master of the estate, owner of every stone beneath that roof, could do nothing but lie still and listen to a stranger soak cloth in cold water. Clara worked without speaking for several minutes. She changed the cloth on his forehead, lifted his head slightly to ease his breathing, and pulled the blankets lower when she found the servants had buried him under too much wool. Her hands were careful but not timid. When she touched him, it was not with the reverence of someone handling a duke, but with the urgency of someone tending a man who might yet live if the room stopped waiting for him to die. At last, she leaned close. "Your Grace," she whispered. Adrian strained toward the sound. The command was so unexpected that his awareness sharpened. Clara's fingers found his wrist again. "I have seen men trapped inside fever before. Not often. But enough. If you understand me, move one finger." Adrian tried. Nothing. His mind roared against the uselessness of his body. "Move. Move. Move." A single finger twitched beneath the. Clara went utterly still. Then her thumb pressed lightly over his pulse, not in shock but in confirmation. Again she whispered. He gathered every fragment of strength left to him and moved the finger once more. Her breath caught almost silently. "You can hear, yes." He wanted to shout it. He wanted to tell her Julian had betrayed him. Reed had betrayed him. The medicine had been withheld. Death was not at the door by chance. It had been invited in by the man who would inherit everything. Clara bent lower, so close that no one outside the door could have heard her. "Do not wake yet." The word stunned him. "If they know you can hear, they will finish what they began before morning. Stay still. Let them believe you are lost. I will not leave you. I will not leave you." The promise came from a woman who owed him nothing. A woman he had barely acknowledged. A woman his class would have placed near the back door and thanked with coins if he recovered. Yet in that moment, her voice became the only rope thrown into the dark. Adrian moved his finger once in answer. Clara understood. From that hour, Ashford Manor became a battlefield disguised as a sickroom. Clara sent for fresh water every half hour, but she let only Mrs. Wren bring it. The old housekeeper had served 3 generations of Ashfords and did not frighten easily. When Clara quietly asked whether Lord Julian had access to the medicine cabinet, Mrs. Wren's face changed. When Clara asked whether Dr. Reed had brought his own bottles or used those stored in the house, Mrs. Wren crossed herself under her breath and went to check. Adrian drifted in and out of fever but always returned to the sound of Clara moving through the room. Sometimes he heard her speaking to him as though he were fully awake. Sometimes she counted his breaths. Sometimes she muttered angrily at Dr. Reed's instructions. Once when she thought he slept too deeply to notice, she whispered, "You have a stubborn heart, Your Grace. Use it." By morning, the fever had not broken, but he was alive. That seemed to anger Julian more than grief ever had. He entered shortly after dawn with Dr. Reed and 2 footmen dressed in black, as if already rehearsing morning. "Perhaps," he said, "you look exhausted, Miss Bennet, too exhausted to continue safely." "You look exhausted, Miss Bennet," he said. "Perhaps too exhausted to continue safely." Clara stood from the chair beside Adrian's bed. Her eyes were shadowed from the sleepless night, but her voice remained steady. His fever lessened twice after cooling. It rose again only. Reed's last mixture. Dr. Reed flushed. That is an outrageous implication. It is an observation. Julian looked at the cup beside the. Did you refuse the medicine prescribed by a physician? I refused to give a dose that smelled of foxglove. The room seemed to still. Adrian knew foxglove. A useful plant in careful hands. A deadly one in careless or criminal ones. Dr. Reed's outrage arrived too late to be convincing. You are a nurse, not a physician. You have no authority to contradict me. My father taught me what foxglove does to a weakened heart. Your father was a country healer. And yet he knew how not to kill a fever patient. Julian's face hardened. Enough. You overstep yourself. My uncle's condition is too grave for experiments by a woman who mistakes village experience for medical training. Clara lifted her chin. Then send for another doctor from London. No roads are passable. Then we keep him alive until they are. That is not your decision. No, she said, glancing once at Adrian's motionless face. It is his. And since he cannot speak, I will not let others speak death over him. Julian stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was the first time Adrian heard the true cruelty in him without disguise. You have grown attached to your importance here, Miss Bennet. But let us be clear. If the Duke dies, no one will blame his heir. No one will blame the physician. They will blame the unknown nurse who refused prescribed medicine. Do you understand? Clara did not answer. Remove her. Julian ordered. Mrs. Wren stepped forward. My lord, do not test me, Mrs. Wren. The footman hesitated. They were Ashford men, not Julian's, but the Duke lay silent. An authority, like water, flowed toward the nearest standing male when no one challenged it. One of them approached Clara with visible discomfort. Adrian felt desperation seize him. No. If Clara left, Julian would have the room. Reed would have the medicine. By nightfall, the fever would become a convenient grave. Move. His body refused. The footman touched Clara's arm. She did not struggle, but she looked back toward the bed. And Adrian felt the force of her gaze as if it had reached through the dark and found him. Move. His hand lay near the edge of the mattress. Beside it, on a small table, stood the glass Clara had used to wet his lips. He could hear it faintly whenever the table trembled from footsteps. Julian was speaking again, telling Clara she would be confined to the servants' wing until the household decided what to do with her. Dr. Reed was murmuring that the Duke needed quiet. Mrs. Wren was protesting. The footmen were drawing near. Adrian gathered every remaining piece of himself, every rage, every betrayal, every breath he had not yet surrendered, and forced his fingers outward. They struck the glass. It fell. The sound of shattering crystal tore through the room. Everyone froze. For one impossible moment, no one breathed. Clara turned first. She looked at the broken glass on the floor, then at Adrian's hand which had fallen limp. Again near the edge of the bed, Julian whispered, a spasm. But his voice had changed. Clara's eyes lifted slowly to Adrian's face. He still could not open his eyes. He still could not speak. But beneath the sheet, hidden from everyone else, his finger moved once against the mattress. Her expression did not break. But he knew she had seen. And Clara Bennet, the poor nurse Julian had tried to throw out before dawn, lowered her head as if accepting defeat. While her eyes promised the Duke of Ashford something far more dangerous. She knew he was awake. She knew he had heard. And now so did he. Clara Bennet allowed Lord Julian's footman to escort her from the sickroom because resisting would have taught him too much. She lowered her head like a defeated servant and let the corridor swallow her before she allowed herself to breathe. Behind her, Dr. Reed was muttering about spasms. Lord Julian was speaking in that smooth voice men use when fear tries to sound like authority. He ordered that no one enter the Duke's chamber without permission. And that Miss Bennet was to be watched until the household decided whether her reckless interference had worsened his Grace's condition. To anyone listening, Clara had lost. But beneath her lowered lashes, her mind was already moving. Adrian Ashford had heard everything. He had moved the glass deliberately. He was trapped inside his own fevered body, unable to accuse the nephew who wanted him dead. And unable to protect himself from the doctor who was supposed to save him. That truth terrified Clara more than she wished to admit, but it also gave her something Julian did not have. A living witness. Mrs. Wren found her at the end of the servants' passage, where the old housekeeper's stern face had gone pale. Tell me the truth, Mrs. Wren whispered. Was it a spasm? Clara looked back toward the closed sickroom door. No. Mrs. Wren closed her eyes for one moment. When she opened them again, she looked 20 years older and twice as dangerous. Then what do? We let Lord Julian believe he has frightened us, Clara said. And we keep the Duke alive long enough for Julian to condemn himself. That became the new plan of Ashford Manor, though only 3 people knew it: a village nurse, an old housekeeper, and the Duke, who lay motionless behind locked doors, listening to traitors move around his bed. Clara was not permitted back into the room for several hours, but Mrs. Wren was. The housekeeper carried water, linen, and broth under the excuse that no gentleman wished to manage a fever without clean cloths. Each time she entered, she whispered the smallest reports near Adrian's pillow. Miss Bennet knows. Miss Bennet is safe. Do not wake yet. Reed is frightened. Julian grows impatient. Then, while pretending to straighten the blankets, she slipped Clara's instructions beneath the edge of Adrian's hand. Move once for yes, twice for no. Save your strength. Adrian obeyed because obedience, for the first time in his life, had become an act of survival. Throughout the day, he listened as Julian performed grief for the household. His nephew spoke in the hall with a voice heavy enough to make maids cry. He told the steward that if the worst occurred, Ashford must remain dignified. He stood outside the chapel and allowed people to see him bow his head as though devotion had bent it. But when Julian entered the sickroom alone with Dr. Julian demanded, because the nurse refused the last dose. Reed answered, then give another. Not with half the household watching now. Then remove them. I am a physician, not an executioner. You became one when you accepted my money. A long silence followed. Adrian lay burning beneath the sheets and understood how easily murder could enter a noble house wearing polished shoes and a physician's coat. That evening, Clara was finally allowed back into the sickroom because Dr. Reed could not manage the fever without exposing his own incompetence. Julian stood near the fireplace as she entered, his expression pleasant enough to be murderous. You will do only what Dr. Reed instructs, he said. Clara dipped her head. Of course, my lord. Adrian knew at once she was lying. Her hands remained steady as she crossed to the bed. She looked first at the cup beside him, then the stained cloth, the medicine bottle, the basin, the ash in the fireplace, and the half-open drawer where Reed had left a packet of powdered herbs. Only after measuring the room did she touch Adrian's. Her fingers pressed once. Are you awake? Adrian moved one finger. Yes. Clara wrung a cloth and laid it across his forehead. There is foxglove in the mixture, she whispered. Not enough to kill quickly. Enough to weaken the heart and let the fever be blamed. His hand remained still, but his mind recoiled. I have kept the cup, she continued. Mrs. Wren found the invoice. A peddler sold dried leaves to a servant using Lord Julian. We still need his words. Words Adrian understood. Evidence could be challenged. Servants could be threatened. A village nurse could be dismissed as ignorant or ambitious. But Julian's own confession, heard by people of standing, would finish him. For 2 more days, they fought quietly. Clara changed the medicine when Reed looked away. Mrs. Wren hid the suspect bottles inside a loose stone behind the hearth. The old steward was brought into the secret after Mrs. Wren caught him weeping in the chapel and told him grief would be more useful if it learned to keep watch. Mr. Bellamy, the family solicitor, was summoned under the pretense that Julian wished to prepare for a possible succession. In truth, Clara needed someone present whose word could stand in court beside Adrian's. If Adrian lived long enough to speak. Julian, meanwhile, grew impatient. The fever had begun to loosen its grip. Adrian could feel it. His mind cleared for longer stretches. His fingers responded more easily. Once, in the deepest part of night, he managed to open his eyes a fraction while only Clara sat beside him. Her face was turned toward the candle, shadowed with exhaustion, and for a moment, he saw not a servant, not a nurse, not a woman beneath his rank, but the person standing between him and the grave. He wanted to say thank you. He wanted to say he was sorry he had never noticed the people his estate depended upon, until his life depended upon one of them. His lips did not move. Clara looked down just as his eyes closed again. She took his hand beneath the blanket and held it, not like a nurse checking a pulse, but like someone lending courage to a man who had spent his life pretending he required none. Not yet, she whispered. But soon. On the fourth night, Clara spread the rumor herself. She let a kitchen maid hear her tell Mrs. Wren that the Duke's pulse had weakened again. She allowed Dr. Reed to see her carry away stained linen with a grave face. She stood in the corridor while Julian passed and said just loudly enough that if his Grace survived until morning, it would be a miracle. Julian believed her because ambition always trusts bad news when it arrives dressed as opportunity. Near midnight, he entered the sickroom with Dr. Reed. The curtains were drawn. The fire was low. Adrian lay pale and still beneath the sheets, breathing shallowly because Clara had taught him how. Behind the tall folding screen near the wardrobe stood Clara, Mrs. Wren, Mr. Bellamy the steward, and 2 footmen who had served Ashford longer than Julian had coveted it. Reed approached the bed first. "This is madness," he whispered. "He is weaker, yes, but not dead. If we stop now, perhaps." "If we stop now," Julian said, "he may wake. If he wakes, he will remember enough to ruin us both. He cannot know." He broke the glass. A spasm. "You did not see the nurse's face. She knows something." Clara felt Mrs. Wren's hand close around her sleeve, holding her still. Julian moved to the table. Glass clinked softly. "One final dose. By morning, the fever will have taken him. The nurse will be blamed for interfering with your. You will testify that she refused proper medicine. I will. The estate will pass where it should have gone years ago." Reed's voice cracked. "He raised you. And kept me waiting." The words fell into the dark like a body into water. Julian continued, anger loosening what caution had kept tied. "Do you know what it is to stand beside a man everyone praises and know that every acre, every title, every coin depends on the timing of his death? I smiled at his tenants, I listened to his lectures, I endured his superiority. And all the while, he treated me like a boy who should be grateful for crumbs from his own inheritance." "It was not yours yet," Reed whispered. "It should have been." Julian lifted the bottle. Clara stepped from behind the. "No," she said. "It never was." Julian turned so sharply the bottle nearly slipped from his. For one stunned moment, his face was stripped bare of charm. Then he saw the others emerge behind her one by one and understood too late that the sickroom had become a courtroom. Mr. Bellamy's voice was cold. "Lord Julian, I advise you to set that bottle down." Julian recovered quickly, though not completely. "This is outrageous. A servant's ambush in my uncle's sickroom. Miss Bennet has manipulated you all. She is a village nurse desperate for importance, and now she stages theatre over a dying man." Clara held up the invoice Mrs. Wren had found. "This bears your seal." "A forgery." Mrs. Wren placed the hidden bottles on the table. "These were removed from His Grace's room after every decline. Planted." Dr. Reed looked as if he might faint. Julian saw that weakness and seized it. "Doctor, tell them. Tell them His Grace's illness was natural. Tell them this woman interfered." Reed opened his mouth, but no sound came. Julian's eyes sharpened. "Tell them." The doctor looked toward Adrian, then toward Clara, then at the bottle in Julian's hand. Something in him broke, perhaps conscience, perhaps cowardice, realizing it had chosen the losing side. "I altered the doses," he whispered. "Lord Julian paid my debts and threatened to expose me. The foxglove was meant to weaken the Duke's heart so the fever would appear fatal." Julian lunged toward him. The footman caught him at once. Still, he fought with words. "No one will believe this. No one will take the word of a disgraced doctor and a nurse over an Ashford heir." A sound came from the bed. Small at first. A breath dragged across a raw throat. Then another. Clara turned. Adrian's eyes opened. The room froze as if death itself had stepped back to listen. He was pale, hollowed by illness, and too weak to rise without effort, but the authority in his gaze returned before strength did. Clara hurried to him, but he moved his hand just enough to stop her, not in rejection, but because he needed to speak while the room still held its breath. "I heard you," Adrian said. Julian went white. Adrian's voice was rough, barely more than a rasp, yet every word carried. "The first night. Before Clara entered. I heard you tell him not to waste another dose. Uncle, do not call me that." The blow of those words landed harder than shouting would have. Julian's mouth opened, but his charm had no room left to stand. Mr. Bellamy gave a sharp order, and the footman took him from the room while he struggled, cursed, and finally shouted that Ashford should have been his. Dr. Reed sank into a chair and covered his face. Mrs. Wren began to cry silently, though she turned away at once, offended by her own emotion. Only Clara stayed beside the bed. Adrian looked at her, and all the power he had reclaimed seemed suddenly insufficient for what he needed to say. When I could not speak, he said, you heard me. You made yourself heard. No, he answered. I nearly died before learning how many people in my own house had been unheard for years. Clara lowered her eyes, but he saw the exhaustion there, the strain, the fear she had carried without allowing it to shake her hands. By morning, Lord Julian was locked under guard and Dr. Reed had signed a confession. By week's end, the Crown had taken over the inquiry, and Ashford Manor knew the truth. The heir everyone had admired had tried to murder the Duke for his inheritance. The village nurse everyone had doubted had kept him alive when titles, blood, and formal education had failed him. But Adrian did not let gratitude become a chain. As he recovered, he did not summon Clara like a lord rewarding a servant. He asked if she would oversee the building of a proper infirmary on Ashford land, one open to tenants, labourers, and village children who had once depended on the kindness of her father. Clara tried to refuse at first. She said she would not be turned into a story the nobility could praise at dinner and forget by spring. Adrian listened. That, more than the offer, unsettled her. This is not a reward, he said. It is the first useful thing Ashford has done in years. The infirmary opened 2 months later in a stone building near the old orchard where sunlight touched the windows all morning. Clara filled it with clean linen, drying herbs, locked cabinets, and a rule that no patient would ever be turned away because his coat was worn or her name meant nothing in a drawing room. Adrian visited often, sometimes with estate papers, sometimes with supplies, and sometimes with no excuse at all except the one neither of them spoke for several weeks. On the first clear afternoon of spring, he found Clara in the herb garden behind the infirmary. She was kneeling beside a bed of newly planted lavender, sleeves rolled to her elbows, sunlight catching loose strands of her brown hair. She looked up when his shadow fell across the path. You should not stand too long, she said. You are still recovering. I have been told I have a stubborn heart. That does not make it sensible, Adrian said. But it did bring me here. Clara rose slowly. There was caution in her face, not fear exactly, but the guardedness of a woman who had spent her life being useful and mistrusting the moment. Usefulness began to look like affection. If this is about the infirmary accounts, Mrs. Wren has them. It is not about accounts. The air changed between them. Adrian stepped closer, stopping before nearness could become presumption. He had commanded men all his life, but he would not command this. Not her. When I could not speak, you heard me, he said. When I could not move, you fought for me. But I do not love you because you saved my life, Clara. I love you because you made me understand what kind of man I had become. And what kind of man I still want to be. Her eyes filled before she could look away. I will not ask you to stay because Ashford needs you, he continued. It does. But that is not enough. Stay only if you want to be loved here. Not as my nurse. Not as the woman who saved me. Not as someone I owe a debt to. Stay because I love you and because I will spend every day proving that love without making a cage of it. For a long moment, Clara said nothing. The wind moved gently through the lavender. Somewhere inside the infirmary, a child laughed and the sound drifted through the open window into the garden. And if I stay, Clara asked softly, will you still listen when I tell you the truth? Adrian answered without hesitation, especially then. A tear slipped down her cheek and this time she did not. Adrian lifted his hand slowly, giving her every chance to step back. When she did not, he touched her face with the reverence of a man who understood that tenderness was not another form of possession. Then he bent and kissed her. It was not a vow made before society. Not a claim sealed by a ring. Not a grand gesture meant to turn a nurse into a duchess in the eyes of others. It was quieter than that and true for being quiet, a kiss full of gratitude, regret, wonder, and love. Given by a man who had nearly lost his life before finding his heart. When they parted, Clara rested her forehead against his shoulder. I heard you first, she whispered. Adrian closed his eyes and held her carefully. The room where he had nearly died no longer ruled him. The nephew who had betrayed him no longer defined his bloodline. The house that had once waited for inheritance now had an infirmary filled with living voices. And in the garden behind it, the Duke of Ashford stood with the woman who had heard him in silence and loved him without needing him powerless. For the first time in his life, Adrian did not feel like a man saved from death. He felt like a man being taught how to live.